we talk about racial equity and inequities in education. Today, we'll address racial equity in the workplace with a particular focus on how to improve access and communication in a diverse workplace. The Civil Rights Act prohibited discrimination in the workplace, but we must acknowledge that while workplaces have worked towards becoming more diverse and inclusive, more can always be done. A meta-study showed that hiring discrimination against Black people hasn't changed in the last 25 years, and Latinos have only seen a moderate drop in discrimination against them, according to an article in Forbes. For example, there will be fewer callbacks, which means a lower chance at finding a job. This can also mean fewer offers for applicants looking for a job and less negotiation on offers and compensation. This includes Black and Latino Americans who have college degrees and shows an ever-growing disparity in wealth gaps. In an article by Christian E. Weller, Weller addresses the systematic obstacles that African Americans face in the job market. They have higher unemployment rates, fewer job opportunities, lower pay, poorer benefits, and greater job instability. When this many prominent barriers exist, it's incredibly hard to find and keep a job. An example of career instability for African Americans is that when the economy sours and their unemployment rates also take longer to decline when the economy improves than is the case for whites, a phenomenon often described as last hired, first fired. Not enough has been done to incentivize and encourage holding Black and African American workers to the same standard as their white counterparts. What some people of color do is whiten their resumes during job searches. This means they're deleting references to their race in hopes of increasing their likelihood of being hired. Research found that companies are more than twice as likely to call minority applicants for an interview if they submit whitened resumes than candidates who reveal their race. Research created 1,600 fake resumes for entry-level jobs. Some clearly indicated the race of the applicant, while others were whitened or scrubbed of racial clues. 25% of whitened resumes for African Americans received requests for interviews, whereas 10% of non-whitened resumes received offers. 21% of whitened resumes for Asians received offers, whereas 11.5% of non-whitened resumes for Asians received offers. In one study to test the likelihood of whitened resumes when diversity was mentioned by employers, they found that minorities were half as likely to whiten their resumes when applying for those jobs, with employers who said they care about diversity. Let's look at Baltimore City based on the findings from Changing the Future, Building Racial Equity Across Baltimore's Workforce Ecosystem. In Baltimore, African Americans own nearly half of all businesses, yet employ only 2% of the city's paid employees and account for only 1.4% of all sales. They also earn less than their white counterparts and are largely employed in lower-wage occupations. According to the report, a significant number of individuals and organizations engaged in workforce development recognize that serving a majority African American population is not alone a strategy for advancing racial equity, but fail to apply a racial equity lens when creating programs or policies. In 2017, the average wage for African Americans was $38,798, while the average wage for white people was almost double at $66,612. This gap exists across all occupations in the Baltimore metropolitan area. According to Race Forward, the Center for Social Racial Equity Indicators, a Baltimore ecosystem snapshot, folks just don't talk about race as a barrier to the workforce. They just don't do it. Racial equity strategies must be systemic, race-explicit, and outcome-oriented. To be effective, these strategies must not only tackle the effects of systemic racism in the form of racialized barriers, but also its root causes. Similar to education, desegregating a community or system doesn't remove the ideologies and personal actions of individuals that continue to perpetuate and take advantage of racist beliefs and systems. A report on racial equity in public sector jobs says that democracy, freedom, equality, and justice are often purported to be fundamental values in the United States. However, critical reflection reveals a strong contradiction between these aspirations and our outcomes. While the civil rights movement successfully pressured government to be more inclusive and substantial improvements have been made, racial inequities still exist. 50 years after the Civil Rights Act, governments are examining policies and practices that perpetuate inequities without being explicit, including within our own workforces. This is a statement that blatantly reflects a common statement all workplaces should acknowledge and keep in mind when examining racial equity practices in their own workforce. A report called The Journey to Equity and Inclusion mentions a culture taboo, talking about race at work. This can be said for many different environments, but 32% of HR professionals do not feel safe voicing their opinions about racial justice issues in the workplace, which is dangerous in a workplace where everyone needs to be heard or feel comfortable for voicing concerns. But what can be done to create a more equitable and safe workplace? An article by Evelyn Carter suggests 3 things. First, we should invest in adequate employee education. This is a reality for people of color in the workforce that can be easily overlooked or misunderstood by white employees and their counterparts. The burden should not be on people of color to educate others, but organizations and employers must be willing to use their own resources and time to raise awareness and create strategies to aid their coworkers. Carter says there's no one-size-fits-all answer to what kind of training or education will work best. This is something that takes time, but this form of education should include discussions of allyship, leadership, and addressing biases on an individual level. Second, she says that we should build connection and community. When there is a lack of open communication and comfort in potential discussions about race and inclusivity, there also comes anxiety and disconnect at the potential discussion of these topics. Leaders must be more willing to, unprovoked, bring up discussions of racial justice and equity on different levels, be that local, national, or global, even starting with an individual employee or the workplace as a whole. Lastly, we must go beyond recruiting and hiring to create better environments. Hiring and recruiting employees of color means creating an inclusive and diverse workplace, but we also need to assign work and goals for employee growth to keep them in steady jobs and leadership positions. Because this is our last episode, let's review our other topics. In episode 5, our topic was education. We discussed the significance of college degrees in our job market, specifically how this ties into the historical significance of HBCUs as a community for Black Americans. We also talked about affirmative action in higher education and its necessity because of the continued injustices in our society. However, we mentioned that creating available spaces for students of color in higher education doesn't eliminate the cost of attendance and lack of generational wealth for many families. The cost to work towards a degree is incredibly high, especially for private universities and out-of-state students. However, this can be helped by transfer credits in attending 2-year community colleges. We mentioned specific and unique barriers for ESOL and international students who require more resources and better treatment in all levels of the education system. In episode 4, we talked about transportation and racial inequities. An important part of this episode was income inequality, but we must continue to remember that income status doesn't always tie into this discussion of racial equity. This is because income inequality has lots of different factors, and while it does overwhelmingly impact communities of color, it's only a portion of this discussion on racial equity. We talked about transportation and housing, specifically regarding gentrification and urban renewal. We also looked into Maryland-specific examples, particularly barriers to transportation and safety regarding the process to get a driver's permit and license. We mentioned that a lack of transportation can present a barrier to voter accessibility, but states like Minnesota have created resources to make voting more accessible for college students and those who need to vote by mail. We specifically talked about the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on public transportation, which is incredibly important for low-income and communities of color in major cities. Similar to episode 5's discussion on ESOL students, we looked into language barriers in the metro and how this is unsafe for drivers and riders alike and targets individuals, especially Spanish speakers, whose first language isn't English. We also talked about healthcare and how a lack of transportation can be detrimental to communities that are overwhelmingly impacted by health concerns. In episode 3, our topic was housing and income inequality. We started by talking about the history of redlining and its impact on housing today. Redlining was a method of segregation that creates wealth disparities by race and can explain why many neighborhoods typically have a majority race. For example, a neighborhood that is predominantly white or predominantly Black. We talked about how policies created to help targeted communities can be ineffective because they aid some of the wealthiest households. We also went into depth on specific demographics that not only target people of color, but also explain housing concerns. These demographics are the formerly incarcerated, which is related to race because of the school-to-prison pipeline and the racial makeup of prisons, which doesn't reflect the racial makeup of the United States population. Another demographic is veterans because the military tends to advertise itself more in high schools that are low income, which often means more students of color. Lastly, we talked about gentrification breaking up low-income communities of color, especially in cities, and how eminent domain targets those same communities, which forces them to find new places to live. In episode 2, we talked about access to healthy foods, specifically how hard it is to get healthy foods. This also targets low-income communities of color who live in food deserts. As a reminder, a food desert is a community that has limited access to affordable and healthy foods. We also mentioned that communities are more likely to suffer from conditions like diabetes. Despite these topics being different, they all can link together as one larger discussion. At the end of each discussion, we must remind ourselves that there isn't a simple solution. We must also remember that racial equity won't come by in one day, but instead we must start now and continue for a better future. Looking more into solutions in organizations with similar goals is always a great place to start, no matter what you're trying to do.